Welcome to Threat Level X, Episode 2, which is entitled Everything You Know Is Wrong. I am your host, The Rage Hammer, and in the first podcast of this series, I spoke about the Marxist assault on Western identity. Now, this episode is going to get into the specifics of Marxist assaults on the West, in particular the tropes sown by Marxists. Now, everything you think you know is wrong. That is the central thesis of this episode. So if you consider the tropes of popular culture, everything from the racial stereotypes and narratives about power on down, it's skewed by media and entertainment industry that serves power above all else. Now for this episode, I'm going to be focused on a Marxist philosopher named Louis Althusser, and I am specifically going to examine his concept of an ideological state apparatus, or an ISA, and a repressive state apparatus, or an RSA. Now, in Marxism, you have a bifurcated structure. Now, first, there is the infrastructure, which is the base. These are the forces, means, and relations of production, such as workers, materials, and the relations between workers or workers and employers. Second, there is the superstructure, which is your culture and your ideology, such as your laws, your art, your politics, worldviews, beliefs, and so on. Now, for Karl Marx, the infrastructure produces the superstructure in order to ensure that infrastructure continues unchecked, unabated, uninterfered with. Althusser goes further by identifying the means by which a ruling class perpetuates the infrastructure, the RSA and the ISA. Now, the RSA is the police, the courts, the military, and it is deployed either through violent or non-violent means to keep people in their place, be it the elites in their rarefied air or the lower class out of the elite spaces. It is the hard power. It's why you get a $500 ticket for speeding and you have to go to court and go on a payment plan because you can't afford to pay it all at once. You have interest on top of that. So you're perpetually indebted to the very state your tax dollars pay for as a taxpayer. So they're fining you for doing things that put you at risk. It's why we have a proliferation of laws for every behavior, every choice, and every action, victimless or not. It's to provide the state and those who own the state with a justification for identifying your conduct as criminal. It's why victimless crimes like jaywalking or loitering exist. There's a deeper social order being perpetuated, and in order to perpetuate that order and that power, the state and its owners need power over your every move. They need leverage, and what better way to get leverage than to put you into perpetual debt, or the threat of perpetual debt, for minor traffic violations or behavioral issues. Now, the ISA, or the ideological state apparatus, perpetuates this by promoting a civic value system that legitimates the RSA's nanny state overreach. You are conditioned to believe that America is good, that government is good, and the reason people hate us the world over is our freedom and prosperity, and that if you're not up to anything criminal, you have nothing to fear from a search of your home or your car. You know, it's good old-fashioned envy or just good old-fashioned criminality that causes people to dislike America or the authoritarian structure of America. Now, additionally, the ISA doesn't allow for you to know what your own government and the people connected to that government are doing. That's why we have social media companies labeling your post as potentially misleading. It's why Twitter and Facebook blocked the dissemination of a recent series of stories on Joe Biden's youngest son, Hunter. Now, if they do allow the information to be distributed, they must figure out a way to discredit that information or manage it down to a minimal effect on power. As time goes on, the lines between the RSA and the ISA are blurred because the same people own both. Now, in the previous episode, I identified those people as the shareholder class in America and the West. Now, the shareholder class may be identified as the top 20% of individuals by wealth. Now, that 20% in America owns 92% of the stock market by overall value. The further you go up the ladder in the top 20%, the more concentrated wealth becomes and the more concentrated power becomes. Now, Saul Alinsky said that power goes to just two poles, those who have money and those who have people. And today, those with money have the people, and they direct them any which of a way that they want them to go through the ISA. Althusser put it in the following terms. This is a direct quote. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And that's why you see a guy like Joe the Plumber in 2008 expressing class solidarity with a candidate like John McCain, whose entry and ascendance into politics was financed by his wife's family, as they owned an alcohol distributorship bestowed upon them by the state of Arizona. Now, McCain publicly condemned government interference in economics. He professed to be a free market capitalist and all the trappings thereof. But a distributorship in America is the very definition of government interference in the economy. It gives the distributor a de facto monopoly on a good or service by giving them the exclusive right to distribute that good or service. It's estimated that distributorships add up to 20% to the cost of alcohol in the United States. Now, in the first episode, I talked about Marxists trying to heighten the contradictions in a system. John McCain's publicly professed loyalty to capitalism belies his career's financing by a government-issued distributorship owned by his wife's family. It's the very contradiction I'm talking about. And Althusser's assertion that ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence is directly relevant to Joe the Plumber's endorsement of McCain. Because Joe the Plumber looked at John McCain as the emblem or the candidate that was closely associated with free market capitalism. But McCain wouldn't have a career under free market capitalism, because he wouldn't have that alcohol distributorship to finance his ascendance in politics. Now, most fortunes made and kept in the United States are a direct result of a person's ability to cultivate government relationships, more so than any genius they demonstrate as inventors or innovators of goods or services. Walmart is good at extracting concessions from local governments like tax abatements and subsidies that enable Walmart to externalize the cost of their stores to taxpayers, while also undercutting local businesses that form the tax base of the municipalities that are giving Walmart an advantage over local businesses that have to pay their own way. If you're a local business owner, a small business owner, you don't get to pass off the cost of your construction for your storefront to a taxpayer. Walmart does. Amazon also demands the same thing in every locality that they build distribution centers in. That's not capitalism. It's mercantilism on steroids. Any type of subsidy points you to mercantilism. And I want that to be clear as we go forward. Now, the classical understanding of mercantilism is that countries try to increase their exports while decreasing their imports in order to build surpluses of gold or currency. That gives them the advantage. Now, the United States and other wealthy countries now run trade deficits with the likes of China and India. So calling the U.S. and European countries in the EU mercantilist might appear incorrect. But the reality is that in today's global economy, the only lines between the United States and China are on a map. The two are integrated to the point of inseparability. China is the U.S. manufacturing base. They are the new Rust Belt. And the U.S. is China's consumer base. The U.S. represents about 40% of China's gross domestic product. All that has happened over the past 60 years is that the shareholder class in the U.S., that's the class that most of our Marxists come from, that shareholder class relocated our manufacturing base abroad. But it's still our manufacturing. These are still U.S. companies like Apple and GM and others. Saying that the U.S. runs a trade deficit with China is like saying that one of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims ran a flesh deficit with Jeffrey Dahmer. It's a complete misrepresentation. The way the U.S. and China reconcile the trade deficit is simple. China runs a debt deficit with the U.S. It buys our debt, which is the equivalent of buying U.S. dollars, in order to enable itself to continue exporting to the United States. This has the effect of lowering the value of China's currency, which is critical to China's exports. One of the reasons we buy Chinese goods is that they are produced cheaply. The major reason that they are produced cheaply is because China devalues its currency through its monetary policy and through the acquisition of U.S. treasuries and dollars. The notion that China and the U.S. are distinct nations with separate interests is idiotic. They're merely two regions within the same economic entity. All the traits of a mercantilist economic arrangement are there. It's just two sides of the same coin. China gets to run an export surplus, and we get someone to buy our debt and provide us with cheap finished goods. The same argument can be made of European Union countries as well, and their external trade partners. Now you take Kenya. Kenya can export raw coffee beans to the EU, but if the coffee beans are roasted in Kenya, there's a tariff that makes the beans prohibitively expensive. That's because the EU's protectionism allows for raw bean importation so that German roasters can finish the beans. Saying that Kenya is mercantilist or that Germany is capitalist in this arrangement is absurd. Germany and its fellow EU state France hold the power within the EU, which is why Greece was forced to buy French and German armaments as part of its bailout package. At a time when the Greeks were resorting to a barter economy for basic necessities, their government was purchasing weapons from French and German defense contractors. That's not capitalism. That's good old-fashioned colonial mercantilism. And we have a good many countries who have been christened emerging economies that are anything but. China, India, Brazil, these countries are still very much the colonies of the West. Their entire economic structure rests on Western demand, and their entire supply and technical know-how comes from the West. That's the inherent contradiction in the system that the Marxist would exploit. Here's a purportedly capitalist system resting on so-called free trade between economies, and it's actually just the same colonial system of centuries past, and the trade is anything but free. In the early 2000s, China had a per capita GDP on par with El Salvador. That's hardly an economic powerhouse. Now, if you fast forward to 2019, and the United States per capita GDP was over $65,000. Chinese per capita GDP in 2019 was roughly $10,200. So calling China a communist state is a bit like calling the U.S. a free state. It's an oxymoron. Both have authoritarian surveillance states aimed directly at their own citizens. Both have a corruptocrat revolving door between the public and private sectors that makes distinctions between the public and private sector virtually impossible to discern. And both have elections where people know that their votes won't result in any real material or substantive change. It's just that China is openly totalitarian to the world, and the United States tries to maintain a ridiculous facade. Now, the ideology that underpins China's culture is explicitly Marxist, but that's exactly the point Althusser is making. Ideology represents the imaginary relationships of individuals to their real conditions of existence. The United States has been at war for 2 decades, but Congress has never explicitly declared war. Congress simply issued an open-ended authorization for the use of military force that has enabled 3 presidents to wage a never-ending, no-boundaries war. Now, people who talk about a one-world government in this environment miss the point. We already have a one-world government in terms of our elites. In March 2009, there was an author named David Rothkopf who released a book entitled Superclass. It received decent reviews, it had decent sales, but you've probably never heard of it. Now, the central thesis of this book was that there was a global power elite, identified as some 6,000 people on a planet of 6 billion people, who did the following. They run our governments, our largest corporations. the powerhouses of international finance, the media, world religions, and from the shadows, the world's most dangerous criminal and terrorist organizations. They are the global superclass, and they are shaping the history of our time. What Rothkopf alleges is absolutely the truth. 1 out of every million of us on this planet belongs to a superclass. That's not 1%. That's not 0.1%. That's not even 1/100th of 1%. That's 1/1000th of 1% of the population calling the shots for everybody else. If you don't believe me, consider this. In the United States, under 232 media executives, spread across 6 media conglomerates, control 90% of the information Americans receive every day through their media. This notion that a one-world government or the New World Order is off in the distant future belies the reality that the future is now. Let's go back to what Althusser said. Ideology, that is, what you believe, represents the imaginary relationship of individuals, which is what individuals believe about themselves and their society and their culture, to their real conditions of existence, which is the way things actually are. Now, you are an ant among the Nephilim, and you have no perspective to enable you to even grasp the realities being foisted upon you by giants. Everything you know is wrong. While you're arguing over white privilege, transgenderism, abortion, or whatever contradictions the Marxists are heightening or sowing, you are like an insect caught in a spider's web. You're just being spun and spun around, wrapped up tighter and tighter in silk, until the spider comes back to you later and sucks out your liquefied innards. The only concept you need to be focused on is power. How does this empower me? And how does this disempower me? Why should I be angry about this and not that? Why do I care about this particular thing, and how did I come to care about it? Why do I think what I think about any particular issue? And is it because I think it or because I was told to think it? When you hear the pundit on the news or the influencers on social media, and they're talking about concepts like capitalism or socialism, ask yourself what those things are. Sit down and think about what capitalism is, and then go read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, and you'll likely be stunned at your version of capitalism relative to Adam Smith's version. That's because what you think of as capitalism isn't capitalism. What's been passed off as capitalism to you for your entire existence isn't capitalism. The same is true of socialism, of Marxism, of any and all other terms you've heard tossed about at school or in the media. In the first episode of this series, I said that Marxists, more aptly those who profess Marxist beliefs and employ Marxist tactics, were engaged in a full-scale assault on meaning as a means of eroding Western identity. Now, the first step of uprooting an old identity is to get at the actual roots, which are the meanings that underlie that identity. Now, the Marxist loves to take identity and transmogrify it or transform it into ideology. Why? Because one is rooted in the ability to think about who we are, why we are, what we are, and where we're headed. People with identities know how to think. They are actively engaged in their world. They're actively engaged with their world. They're formulating theses about that world and resolving conflicts between reality and their theses about that world to come to a truth, and they're doing it independently of the media and entertainment industry. What is truth? It is what is. What is a lie? It is what is not. People with ideologies, on the other hand, know what to think, not how to think. They're passively engaged with their world at best, and every bit of data they obtain from the reality around them is filtered through their ideology. At most, these people have an imaginary relationship with their real conditions of existence. That's all they have, a giant collectivist game of pretend. You've seen these people. Many of you probably are these people. You walk around screaming slogans or phrases. Death tax, No justice, no peace. Compassionate conservatism. I feel your pain. Make America great again. They're locked into the matrix, and they're asleep and dreaming, but they think that they're awake. They latch on to whatever others have christened emblematic of their ideology, which is why conservatives gravitate towards a decidedly unconservative president like Ronald Reagan, who hiked taxes 6 times in 8 years, increased spending every year he was in office, quadrupled deficits from the Carter administration, and signed immigration amnesty into law. It's why liberals gravitate towards the not at all liberal Bill Clinton, who signed an authoritarian crime reform bill into law that led to mass incarcerations for minorities over victimless crimes like drug possession, welfare reform that condemned generations to dependency and destitution rather than liberating them from poverty, and whose personal conduct included getting fellatio while on the job and multiple accusations of rape. So how can you discern what is real and what is illusion when you don't even understand the meanings of the terms real and illusion? This is what Marxists do, and it's what our elites do. They seize the terms and they play with their meaning. It is not that our world's elites believe in the doctrines of Karl Marx or Jesus Christ or Muhammad or any other thinker or prophet or God. The elites believe in power, in stealing fire from Olympus, hoarding it from the lower classes, in becoming gods on the earth over their fellow man. They are more aptly represented by the term Luciferian than any other nomenclature or designation. That's going to be important in later episodes. Power is the central concern of the elites and their proxies in academia, the media, and the culture at large. The Marxist or Luciferian assault on Western identity and the logic and reason that underlie that identity is a matter of power and nothing else. This has been the second episode of Threat Level X, and I am your host, the Rage Hammer. In the next episode, I will lay out the Luciferian Marxist agenda in terms of programs such as depopulation and population control, debt, and other methods by which these elites obtain and maintain control.